And the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran could plunge the entire global economy into recession. Iran controls access to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important shipping routes for energy supply. And Tehran has already threatened to close it for shipping traffic in the past.
The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passageway between Oman and Iran. Tankers from many countries line up here, most of them transporting crude oil from the Gulf region to Europe, Asia and North America. The Strait of Hormuz is a bottleneck between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, only 55 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The waterway for big ships is only 3.7 kilometers wide. In the past, Iran has often threatened to block the route, and it could do so again amid the ongoing conflict.
Hormuz will be a big threat to the whole worldwide economy if it will be involved in this war. So there are strategic positions from the Iranian government which see Hormuz as their key to have a security for their interests in the region, in the south of Iran, in the Persian Gulf. If this happens, we will have a big threat to the whole world economy.
A fifth of the world's oil supply is transported through the Strait of Hormuz. The channel is the second biggest route for oil after the Strait of Malacca and more significant than the Suez Canal. So it would be difficult to compensate for any disruption amid the ongoing conflict. The result would be higher oil prices. The Israel-Iran crisis has already sent prices spiking to the highest level in months. And if that is sustained over the coming weeks, consumers around the world will see the impact in the cost of goods.
And we can now speak to Claudia Kemfert. She's the head of energy, transportation and environment at the German Institute of Economic Research. Welcome back to DW. The world economy has been in very much uncertain waters since the re-election of Donald Trump. Is it ready for an open conflict between Israel and Iran?
Well, it's very difficult to say because it's really complicated. And of course, the energy plays a crucial role here as because of the Strait of Hormuz, which is really important for the trade flows. And this conflict really threatens the energy markets tremendously because the region exports a lot of oil, but also gas, liquefied natural gas. So if there's an ongoing conflict and it's going severe or even worse, then there might be some kind of worst-case scenarios which are really bad for the global economy.
What would that worst-case scenario look like? Which parts of the world would be most affected? In what ways?
Yeah, I mean, the worst case scenarios would be that, of course, the oil price would increase, but also the gas prices, which really then harms the economy over different ways. Energy intensive companies are negatively affected, as well as households and gasoline consumers, like car owners or those who have high heating costs. And all this affects the whole economies on a global scale. But Asia, of course, is really also affected if the Strait of Hormuz is in any kind of affected, or there might be trades, supply chain disruptions, which are really severe on the energy market, as well as the overall global market and the overall economy. But right now, the oil price has been increased, but not that much that there are severe impacts on the global economy. But there is a danger of stagflation, meaning there could be a potential inflation, but also a stagnation, which is really bad for the global economies.
China is Iran's biggest oil consumer. Could they maybe convince the regime to leave the Strait of Hormuz open?
Yeah, I hope so, because China indeed is affected because they import from Iran also the oil, and Asia in total gets over 80% of their energy also over this trade route. And if this is blocked, that's really bad. I mean, everybody or each country is really should do everything they can do in order to avoid that, because that would be really bad for the global economy. but also bad for the international energy markets. Oil and gas is not scarce. We have enough, but it's difficult to compensate if the Strait of Hormuz is really in any kind of disrupted.
Let's talk about the possibility of compensation. Does the world have a contingency plan?
Well, I don't think so that there's really a contingency plan, and there's really difficult to compensate because there are not a lot of pipeline routes which could be used in that case if the trade through this Strait of Hormuz is interrupted. And of course, we have some kind of strategic oil reserves in each country and everywhere, or gas reserves as well. So there are, there is a certain time where we can leave without this the Strait of Hormuz trade flows, but of course, we would be better prepared, and the best preparation would be to really don't get this worst case scenarios done.
That was Claudia Kemfert, economist from the German Institute of Economy. Thank you so much for all those insights. Great speaking to you today.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Let's talk about all of this with Kate Ferguson from DW Business. Lovely to see you, Kate. What are the chances that Iran really would block off the Strait of Hormuz?
This is actually very unlikely to happen because if it blocks off this route, it also curtails its own ability to export oil, most of which goes to China and is a really important source of revenue. But the security situation itself in the Strait of Hormuz is such that ships are being deterred from taking this route, and that in turn drives insurance premiums up, and those are the costs that are then passed on to consumers. One of the biggest dangers on the Strait of Hormuz right now actually comes from GPS scrambling. These are basically attacks on navigation systems, and you can imagine how dangerous that is at sea. We actually saw two tankers collide in the Strait of Hormuz this week. The exact cause hasn't been confirmed, but it shows how dangerous this passageway has become. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that this isn't just about oil. Europe in particular has become very reliant on liquefied natural gas from the Middle East since weaning itself off Russian gas. So a potential price shock is now coming on two levels, oil and gas.
OK, so there are already things being felt. If this were to happen, what could an escalation like this do to the global economy?
So energy is a really big driver of inflation, and countries around the world have been battling inflation since the pandemic, since the war in Ukraine. If inflation stays high, central banks are much more reluctant to lower interest rates, and that means that borrowing stays expensive. If it's expensive to borrow money, you're going to see less investment, less momentum, and that can potentially lead to a recession. Now, the global economy is already on really shaky ground due to these tariff disputes and various geopolitical uncertainties, so this is really the last thing it needs.
We know that Israel has already been engaged in a war in Gaza for a year and a half. Can Israel afford another conflict like this?
In a nutshell, yes, it can. And that's because of the resilience of its most important sector, which is high tech. That makes up about 20% of Israel's GDP. And I was speaking to an economist yesterday from Israel, and he was saying that basically high tech has remained completely unscathed since the war began. Reservists have been able to work remotely, for example. So there's been a lot of resilience there. The sectors that have been affected, like tourism and agriculture, they might make up a very small portion of GDP. So it has really been quite negligible. The one vulnerability Israel has is actually to do with public spending. It's had to borrow a whole lot more money to fund this war. And there are some concerns that this isn't going to be sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Back to the Strait of Hormuz. Let's say Iran doesn't close it. Can it threaten its enemies in any other way?
Yeah, so Iran is pretty much weak on every front right now. But the area where it does pose some risk is actually in cyber warfare, in hybrid warfare. Back in 2023, Iranian hackers actually managed to get into water facilities in the United States. They didn't manage to cut off supply, but this is a real area of vulnerability. Israel has world-class cyber defense, but the United States and Europe actually do not. And that's an area that could potentially be at risk, especially because in the United States, federal agencies have been gutted. So coordinating a response to this potential risk is actually quite difficult right now.
Kate, thank you so much for that. That's Kate Ferguson from DW Business.